Thank you so much to everyone who joined us, especially those who came back after the first episode. That's very gratifying when we're trying a new experiment. So we're so thrilled to have friends of the network of centers and colleagues, Nagla, Yolanda, and Aayush from the American University in Cairo, from the UNDP, and from the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore. All have really, really extensive experience around issues of access, infrastructure, looking at inequalities along so many different axes, looking at issues around the gig economy, innovation, platforms. So we're really excited to hear them talk about what this less positive digital transformation looks like and what the sort of ongoing effects of this are, particularly on the most vulnerable and people who the recent inequalities are exposing and discriminating against in weirder and stranger ways. So without further ado, I'll just welcome all of you, especially those who are part of the network of centers. And I will hand over to Nagla. So the very quick agenda is Nagla will present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have Yolanda and Aayush also join in. They will each present for about 7-8 minutes based on their own research and work. And then we'll open it up to your questions. Please feel free to throw in questions into chat. We ask that you try and hold off until they finished with their presentations so that it's not distracting, and we really hope we can have a good organic conversation at the end. And if those who aren't speaking right now could mute, that would be great. Thank you so much. Nagla, over to you.
Thank you very much, Malavika. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak to you all, and thanks to Asia Digital Hub and Network of Centers, and for giving me the chance and to tell the story of Egypt. So without further ado, I will try and use my 15 minutes efficiently. If I speak too fast, you can yell at me, wave at me. So basically, very quickly, where we are in Egypt. I chose to talk about the lives versus livelihood dilemma, ethical dilemma for the marginalized, and how this plays out in Egypt in light of COVID-19. Where we are today, until yesterday, we had the numbers 10,000, about 10,500 cases. The announced increases are between 350 and 500 every day. Poorer areas of town are cordoned, are closed when the cases are detected. There is a partial lockdown with a curfew with a fine of about $250 for people if they break the curfew. Restrictions seem to be easing, and it's not very clear why or how, with the cases expanding and people not really abiding by the curfew very much. So let me just get to the point. I want to talk about virus and vulnerability from the individual to the collective. So just like the virus afflicts the individual's physical vulnerabilities, those who are ill, and attacks the less healthy of society, it is also serving to expose society's economic and social sore spots, socioeconomic and political vulnerabilities. Inequality in Egypt, like in other parts of the global south, is multi-layered, complex, multidimensional, multifaceted, covering inequality of opportunity, access to health services, sanitation, education, employment, living conditions. It cuts through gender, geography, ethnic, and social backgrounds, and you have situations where the analog and the digital device just merge to feed into a developmental divide. So what does education online mean when you do not have access to internet, when you have illiterate parents, and you live in a shack? So this is the context that I'd like to speak about. And in that sense, the lives versus livelihood dilemma takes on a dramatic twist. So basically, it has been said about the poorer parts of the world to die from hunger or to die from the disease. This is actually not a far-fetched opportunity, a potential or option, because what happens is that people are faced with The option is either stay home and go hungry, or go to work, get sick, and then eventually die, and then your kids will also get hungry as well, as they have nothing to fall back on. So this is an ethical dilemma. It's no longer a binary, it's a choice. The choice between lives versus livelihood converges into a lose-lose scenario, and a cruel, vicious circle that makes us question our moral standing of the current social contract and the current situation. Very quickly, informal livelihoods in Egypt. I want to talk about informal workers and informal dwellings. And of course, issues related to women will always come up in that story. So officially, this is a country where 1 in 3 people in Egypt live below the poverty line, defined as $1.5 a day. 6%, more than 6% live in extreme poverty, less than $1 a day. And the World Bank estimates 60% of the population are poor or vulnerable. Sharp inequality across regions, and the poverty levels in Egypt's poorest villages exceeds 80%. Who are the informal workers? These are people who work as either individual freelancers or a family enterprise, a family business, or are actually employed by the formal sector without a contract or any benefits. This constitutes 60% of the country's labor force. And if we exclude the agricultural sector and we look only at the urban sector, it is more than 50%. Actually, 53% of the labor force are urban workers in the informal sector. That's about, the total is about 20 million people contributing to 40% of the economy. So that's sizable. And if we look at informal dwellings, quite a sizable portion of those live in informal dwellings, where you have more than half of Cairo's residents, 40% of Alexandria, higher shares in the upper Egypt and the governorates. Indeed, 40% of Egypt's land consists of areas that lack proper infrastructure and are defined as unplanned areas. A national statistic: 8.3 million people do not live in an apartment, but in a room or kiosk or shack or tent. 6.2 million do not have a tap inside their dwellings. 8.4 persons do not own a private bathroom or kitchen, and the numbers are more in Upper Egypt. Roads are inadequate, healthcare centers, streets, electricity, water, sanitation, sewage, schools, health services. In one of the areas dwelled by garbage collectors, they actually subjected to disease and infections, mostly trachoma and hepatitis B. And the women, even before COVID-19, they sort the garbage, refused to put on gloves because they hope to find valuables and they don't want to miss the opportunity of finding valuables. This is as painful as the reality is. And I'm sorry to paint such a bleak image, but that's the reality. In that context, naturally, these areas are under-serviced. Overall health expenditure in Egypt is anywhere between 1.5 to 2%, depending on of GDP, depending on where we get the statistic, where the constitution requires a minimum of 3%. Global average is 7%. Again, it's a right to health is supposed to be a constitutional right. The expenditures on health are actually mostly carried over by individuals. The private expenditure share is 65% as opposed to government 35%. Out-of-pocket expenses in Egypt, 62% compared to the global average of 19%. Number of hospitals declining, geographical inequality blatant, number of hospitals, physicians, and health workers, health services. This is why figures for COVID-19, even though they're not high, they can be alarming given the quality and the scope of the health services. So then zoom out and look at the economy now. What does the economy look like? It has the big three. The big three for Egypt have been tourism, remittances of Egyptians working specifically in the Gulf countries, the oil-rich countries, and the Suez Canal. Together, they constitute anywhere between 15 to 20%, depending on where you get the figure. Structural unemployment, even though the formal unemployment figures are not high, 8%, but we have unemployment of the youth. 32% of youth in labor force, 21% of labor force that hold advanced university degrees are unemployed, 1/5. 23.1% of women in labor force are unemployed. We have a youth bulge, almost 60% of the population is under 30 years of age. Can be an asset, can be a liability, but the share of youth not in education, employment, or training is 27% of the youth population. So this is the situation. And then comes COVID-19. Now, before we have the informal sector, back to the informal sector, informal dwellings, it has actually cushioned Egypt in previous crises. The two notable ones are the financial crisis of 2008 and the uprisings of 2011. It is actually the informal sector with its agility, with its flexibility. It fulfilled the immediate needs of the poor. It has relied on supply chains of cheap products and has actually, stepped in to support the economy. During the financial crisis, it was completely outside the radar of the system, and it just very, in a flexible manner, was able to fulfill the needs of the economy. During the uprisings, the same thing happened. It actually managed to, throughout its linkages with the formal sector, throughout its ability to offer services and needs, it actually shielded the economy. Not this time. This is the difference. What's new this time? The informal sector is hit in two ways. It's hit indirectly because the shock that came to the big three in the economy is huge. And it's not only shaking the formal sector, big players in the economy, tourism, clearly, remittances of workers in the Gulf, clearly with the fall in the price of oil, but also the fall in Suez Canal and the general recession. But it is also actually hitting the services that parts of the economy. So for example, in education, the fact that education is done online, and I'll talk about that also, there were those little kiosks that offered photocopying services and help to schools in remote areas. All of this is closed. So the demand for informal sector services from the rest of the economy has gone down. And it was a clear, when Qatar and Kuwait imposed restrictions on Egyptians return, there was a huge, which I witnessed firsthand in the offices close to Tahrir Square, of people jamming in, trying to get their papers, desperate to go back to their jobs. All of these are coming back to an economy increasing. Not only now it is structural unemployment, but there is a cyclical unemployment as well because of the overall economic condition in the economy, in the regular sector. What is more serious is that the informal sector itself this time is severely hit in two ways. There is a direct demand shock because the sector itself, there is no demand for it. People who work informal sector work in informal neighborhood nurseries, in domestic help, as street doing services on the street. People are afraid of them. Nobody wants to employ them, so they are asked to stay home, and they're stigmatized, especially the ones who live in areas that have been infected. And then there is a supply shock. They themselves cannot come out as laborers, as their own materials coming from the supply chain from China and elsewhere are no longer, their factors of production are no longer there, their labor and the materials they work with. So there is a complete shock to the economy. And this is where the ethical dilemma stings, because people still want to go to work. They risk falling sick just to feed their families. So from hand-to-mouth living to hand-to-mouth relief, what has the state done? The state has offered a payment of £500, which is the equivalent of $30, three-time payment over 3 months as a grant for people, basically to get food, intended to reach 2.5 million. And look at the figure, 2.5 million, and indeed eventually reaching 1.5 million persons. And I'll talk about that in the time that I have. Additional support from the regular safety nets, expansion in the ration cards, the regular safety nets, all intended to help people just get by in their daily life. There have been initiatives from corporates, from civil society, from even public figures, everyone's chipping in to feed the people. So from hand-to-mouth to living to hand-to-mouth relief. Now the reality check, £500, $30, the form is to be filled out online. This is a country where more than half of the population are not online. Internet infrastructure is weak to start with. Cyber cafes are expensive and beyond the reach of people. And 15% of the men are illiterate. So how can we talk about filling forms online? Even the regular safety nets services are providing YouTube channel videos and portals and all of this, which is not in sync with the reality. So in the end, the forms, people were getting help from neighbors, from civil society, and I interviewed a number of people, and in one case, helping 120 women ended up with one woman receiving the £500. So with 20 million people in the informal sector, 1.5 million are the ones who actually received. Again, smart cards, expanding the use of smart cards and financial inclusion, where in a country where 2/3 of the people rely on cash and 1/3 hold bank accounts, debit cards 25%, credit cards 3%. So the rhetoric needs to be sensitive to reality, needs to be gradual and realistic. A couple of data stories very quickly. Inaccuracies in data. With informal dwellings, they usually official safety nets require a whole bunch of papers, part of which is a utility bill. And if you're living in an informal dwelling and taking electricity from your neighbor, you will not have an electricity bill, so you will not be able to. You are invisible to the data sphere of the radar of the system. Invisibility, what I call data blur, data blindness to communities, to women especially. And an example, going back to the 500 pound, is that the forms that needed to be filled out had all the professions of men: carpenter, welder, and there was then other include all the women's jobs that are typically done, informal work by women, like domestic service, working in schools, etc., are lumped into other, which is the data blur that I talk about. I have quotes from women, but in the interest of time, I will just I have chilling stories of what happens to first-hand narratives of women, of what they went through, and I can read those during the Q&A. I don't want to take up the time, but it is how they are stigmatized by their workers, how they are unable to get their medication for themselves and for their husbands and their families, how they do their children are not able to do their homework because they're asked to do it online, and they can't afford, and they can't even afford to recharge the internet package, and again, stories about violence at home, etc. But in the couple of minutes that I have, I would just conclude here and say that just like the virus targets individuals' physical frailties, it has actually fiercely attacked and exposed our sore spots as a society, as a collective. And when a woman says, I wish they let us move to end the curfew so we can go back to work, God will make whatever he wants. We will not die except by the will of God. Even death has become expensive. The virus has added insult to injury for the marginalized. And there it is really an important step to pause, to look hard into our social contracts, the moral standing of our policies, the neoliberal policies that have actually produced all these informal pockets in the economy and in our cities, and actually remind us in the true meaning of development as preservation of human dignity. Let's not forget that the Arab Spring, the spark of the Arab Spring, came from an informal seller in Bouazizi in Tunisia. Lastly, what should we do just to be on a positive and hopeful sign? We need to go beyond the hand-to-mouth solutions and for hand-to-mouth living to more sustainable solutions. The universal, people are talking about universal basic income, sure, but let's think beyond that about how can we train, how can we improve the livelihood of people in sustainable manners. A new social contract to deal with informal sector, not from but from a developmental end. Think inclusion, engage, incentivize, not necessarily formalize, they can pay their taxes. And in the end, of course, as always, better data, better policy making, building on efforts. There have been some efforts to improve the database in the country and taking that forward in a way that actually achieves development as dignity, development as inclusion of the less fortunate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nagla. What a tour de force, covering so much content, and there's so much to unpack there. Thank you. And I think especially, where you left it off is a great segue for Yolanda, given that she works on development with a very global perspective. And I think going from the local, from Egypt as a case study to actually look at more systemic and global patterns, we would love to hear from Yolanda to sort of take this forward. Thank you. Yolanda?
Sure. Thank you, Malavika, and thank you, Nagla, for the very powerful, as was put it, very powerful introduction to the Egypt situation. And you've already touched upon quite a few points that I will talk about, like gender, like the informal workers. As Malavika mentioned, I work on the global portfolio for United Nations Development Program, where I look at digital transformation, And it's really great pleasure to join this conversation and really glad to see many old friends online as well. So really looking forward to the chat later as well. And for me, I feel like this is always a very important topic, but normally not getting enough attention, especially when most of the conversation nowadays are really around immediate reaction, how we fight the virus. And a lot of times we forget about there are billions of people who are disadvantaged and who are even super more vulnerable to the situation. And thank you all of you who joining. I see 15 people online here. And let's not forget, well, 15 of us are here joining this intellectual chat online. And it's actually a privilege. And there are actually equal number of people who cannot enjoy this kind of activity. And the reality is almost half of the world's population, and the latest estimate is 46%, has no access to internet at all. And coronavirus has exposed this digital divide like never before. And so billions of us are getting online to stay in touch, to be educated, to access information, to purchase goods. There are 3 billion people who simply cannot get online. And that's a just shocking number. And these are the people without the reliable connection, and they are more vulnerable. So I was chatting with my colleagues in Asia Pacific last week, and we were talking about how we can disseminate this virus information and get the information to the people. And a colleague and we were talking about all these fantastic digital solutions. And a colleague in Laos simply said, we have no internet access here. We need to use the loudspeakers in the temples to broadcast the information. And that's the reality on the ground. And that's a really important reminder to all of us who work on digital solutions. And let's look at some data beyond the anecdotes. The situation is much worse in poorer countries. And in the developed world, the 87% are connected, while the numbers sharply dropped to 19% in least developed countries. In other words, fewer than 1 in 5 people in the least developed countries are connected. And according to WHO, those are the poorest and the migrants are most vulnerable to the virus. So, and there are other vulnerable populations as well. Let's look at the women, as Nagla already pointed out. And the other number here, globally, women are 23% less likely than men to use mobile internet. So what do we do for them? And this gap is widest in South Asia. And I hope Aayush will talk a little bit more about that in India's situation as well in a bit. And there are other disadvantaged groups as well. Think about the older people who, even if you give them a mobile phone, they may not know how to use them. Think about the people with disabilities. What if they are blind or they cannot read? And people in crisis countries or post-disaster districts. And as Nagla, you mentioned, what about the informal workers and their kids? They simply don't have the basic safety net. And what about the unbanked population? Even when government wants to give them money, there's no way they can receive the money. And COVID-19 really makes the universal digital access even more essential and significant than ever. And this is the first step towards digital inclusion everywhere. So in UNDP, part of that is exactly part of the goal for our work. And so ever since, so for those who doesn't know, but I think most of you should know, probably heard of UNDP, we're the biggest development agency globally, and we work in 170 developing countries. And my team focuses on digital transformation. So ever since COVID hit, we've been collecting digital response at countries. And I can actually share a link where you can also play around with it. Basically, that's a more internal kind of database. I just shared that in the chat. It's basically collecting all the digital response on the ground in our program countries. And looking at those data, we observed one interesting fact that when we talk about digital, actually for COVID response, we see less about the frontier tech like artificial intelligence, data science, and all of those cool stuff, but a very high volume of activities with low tech, for no better word, such as mobile apps, even for non-smartphones. And that's exactly shows the reality, because that's where many developing countries, they simply have higher mobile penetration than broadband penetration. And so digital access is not necessarily the key mandate for my organization. We recognize that as the fundamental and very foundational layer for anything digital to have a real impact. And there are a few different layers of the challenges and the solutions, and I'll quickly touch upon those. The first is accessibility. Internet access is actually considered as one fundamental enabler of human rights, and governments are committed to bring the affordable internet to all by 2020, even though according to the current trajectory, it is hard to realize this goal. So in short term, fighting COVID, of course, like in some countries, we have like easy fix. In Mozambique, I was talking to our colleagues there, they're simply distributing devices to the governments who doesn't have the access. So that's an easy fix in the short term, but in the longer term, it requires a lot of other collaborations. So Secretary General of the United Nations, they have a high-level panel on digital cooperation where there is one dedicated follow-up recommendation on connectivity, and UNDP is working with 20-something other stakeholders to push forward this agenda. And there is also the affordability. The second is around affordability. Even when you have the infrastructure, many people simply cannot afford it. And we realized costing estimate is actually not that easy, but I'll just use one number from Africa. In parts of Africa, 1 gigabyte of data, which is easy for us in developed countries, but it costs nearly 40% of average monthly income in Africa. And what do they do if they cannot get access and they cannot get information around COVID? So in some countries in Africa, they're actually offering free access to official COVID-19 websites or digital channels. That's also another easy fix. And in the longer term, we also have some ongoing work going on, even goes way back before COVID, but by providing internet access, setting up internet cafes, and bringing the broadband penetration higher. And in Bangladesh, for example, there is a program dedicated to that. And since from 5 years ago, they shifted the focus to lower the cost of internet. And therefore, that's the basic step to providing any e-governance service. And that's where they are at now. And that really requires the third element, which is the partnership side, that really needs more actors and more resources into this. And this is where we are hoping to get more private sector engaged. We're working with on that as well to bring together such as Microsoft, GSMA, Google, Facebook, and even companies in China to really come together and contribute their resources, technology, and expertise. And last but not least, I know I'm running over time a little bit, digital literacy and capabilities for government. That is also crucial. Even if you have access, that's not enough. Like, we really need the digital literacy to help people to know how to use and leverage the access they now have and how to educate this new online population. And that's also where we are working on digital privacy, security, and also in terms of training the individuals and also the governments. And let me also end on a positive note. Let's take COVID as the opportunity to accelerate the process, because once it's built, there will be return of investment and then open up the new opportunities such as digital economy. And when we always say at the UN, leave no one behind, and we hope that we can leave no one offline as well. So I end up there, and thank you, and over back to Malavika.
Thank you, Yolanda. That was a really, really useful frame, and for us to step back to think about a lot of these issues. So many things to unpack there, and I'm glad that you also brought in both data as well as the richer qualitative elements. Aayush, if we could hear from you, and then we'll open it up to everyone. And I know that Aayush has done work on the gig economy in particular, but also that CIS has done work on the sort of low-tech solutions that you mentioned, Yolanda, when it comes to their pervasive technology project, looking at dumb phones, looking at how those are used in rural environments to overcome literacy and other kinds of gaps. So Aayush in particular has been looking at the case of migrants, as we've seen those really horrible images of people trying to walk hundreds of kilometers to get home. when work has dried up in cities. And he's been looking at some of the labor law implications as well. So Aayush, we'd love to hear from you on that. And thank you so much, Yolanda.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for what you had to share, and sort of just building from what Malvika already sort of spoke about. And yeah, what she was talking about was precisely like this, images such as this, which have sort of flooded media outlets and organizations in the country. The images of like millions of people migrating back from sort of destination locations, which is typically urban centers in the country, back to their villages across states, where a large chunk of them are from. And this is happening on foot. Indian highways then have been replaced, which have been emptied of the vehicles and are replaced by millions of pedestrians headed back. And this is precisely what happened in terms of the Indian state's response to the outbreak of COVID-19, and in sort of imposing the harshest lockdown without adequate notice, and especially in the context of a neoliberal state that has consistently been withdrawing from the provision of social support and social security over the last 30-ish years. What it then ended up doing was creating a humanitarian crisis in what was already an ongoing epidemiological one. And this is sort of telling in so far as the implications on implications of the outbreak on labor are concerned, and specifically when we talk about informal labor in India. I mean, just as Nagla also spoke about in terms of the telling numbers of labor disaggregation in the country, it's startling how anywhere between 85 to 93% of India's workforce is actually in the informal economy, and a large percentage of that is occupied by migrant workers. And then migrant workers sort of occupy several professions in the Indian urban scape, such as that of security guards, construction workers, sanitation workers. For women, a large section of the migrant women are into caregiving roles such as domestic work and childcare. And that really is the sort of backbone on which India's urban centers lived and thrived on. And while they have been consistently invisible in terms of both like sort of official statistics and policy making by individual states and even at the center, what this has done is sort of thrust them into the limelight and it's sort of telling to look at how the state's response and maybe the lack of foresight even in terms of sort of factoring this in and addressing this crisis has been. And so one move that has getting viral almost is the complete erosion of labor laws in the country. So this is the evidence from several states in India. So this is Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, and Gujarat. So this is just 4 states so far, all of them run by the BJP, which is also at the center. They've announced various degrees of suspension of labor law regimes in the states, and for like anywhere between like 3 months to the next 3 years. And it's been absolutely perverse, right? So in Uttar Pradesh, for example, all but 3 labor laws have been suspended, and this is in a context where where there are about 44 central labor laws in the country. So what that means is that basic protections that were accorded to labor, such as minimum wages, equal remuneration for men and women, basic protections such as the minimum wage law, have been suspended in what has been overtly stated as a way to create more jobs. And now it is important to also look at these states as typically having been the source of the migrants, of a lot of migrant labor that showed you in the image, in the image right before this. And so and also again going back to how about 90% of India's workforce is was already outside of the purview of labor law protections. What this has done is sort of taken a sledgehammer and in responding to what has been a sort of certain villainization of India's labor law framework over the last 20-odd years. So while there is a great case to be made for labor law reform, and this is from across political spectrums and ideologies, the COVID-19 outbreak has been taken as sort of the background for the complete obliteration of whatever little labor law protections were there in the first place. And that takes me to gig workers as well, which tend to typically be migrant workers in India's urban scape. And talking about gig workers has become especially sort of interesting in the current context. One reason being that they were some of them at least were categorized as essential workers when the lockdown was imposed. So so for example, gig on-demand services that were with regards to logistics and food delivery were regarded as essential goods and as providing essential services, and thereby allowed to operate in the during the lockdown, while other more popular on-demand variants such as Uber, for example, had to suspend services at least temporarily. And then what ensued was this sort of race to provide essential services, right? So Uber then transitioned a part of its service from into like an Uber medic, where they sort of had makeshift ambulances for transporting people, and thus getting regulatory forbearance in terms of operating during the crisis. But most interestingly, what has also happened is, on the one hand, there is a certain there's a way in which now e-commerce players can exert great control over the supply chain, since like workers piecemeal even, but I mean at least in so far as ensuring the welfare of workers so far of workers during the crisis. Now, what has been the conversation globally is has been the miscategorization of these workers as independent contractors, but a certain hole is pierced in this rhetoric when given the sort of public overtures that companies in India have been making, and even across the world, in terms of having health insurance, doing cash transfers, having certain moratoriums on loan repayments and so on for workers. While they're not sufficient, but I think it goes a long way in sort of addressing some of the arguments that have been placed by companies so far. And like so also what is very interesting in terms of the gig economy discourse in the global south is that while in the north a lot of the gig economy is about this transition of the labor force as a certain transition from like the informal organization of the workplace, that is the workplace being fissured into the workplace being fissured from what was a more consolidated organizational setup. In India, that the and in various other contexts in the global south, the gig economy conversation has been about formalization of informal labor. And given the sort of labor law approaches that we are seeing building in separate in the states, in various states in the country, and we expect several other states to follow suit, I think it has important implications of what the future of labor law holds. And to quickly talk about a few sort of digital responses, I want to talk about the contract tracing app called Arogya Setu, and about how relief has been directed through direct cash transfers to those who have been affected by the ongoing crisis. And it's important to go back to the numbers around access and use and ownership in India. And so, for example, while there is about, I think, only about 14% of Indian women have own a smartphone. 1 in 4.5 people in the country own a smartphone. So while there is already sort of a divide, a huge digital divide in who has access to a smartphone, it is further mediated along the lines of gender and caste in the country, and that is also the demographic that comprise the most vulnerable parts of a workforce. Now, the cash transfer mechanism in India, which is built on the Aadhaar, which is the one of the largest biometric projects seen anywhere in the world, and is tied to something called that is abbreviated as JAM. So J stands for Jan Dhan accounts, which is bank accounts for everybody. A stands for Aadhaar, and M stands for mobile. So having access to all three is now has been made mandatory to be able to access welfare schemes for the last few years, and now in the ongoing crisis in terms of accessing relief measures that the state has been promising. And a very telling stat to take into account here is that only 10% of adults in India have ever used a mobile phone for a financial transaction. So in a context where such deep divides exist along the fractures in which the Indian society is organized, relief measures are further rendered inaccessible. And also very tellingly, what has happened is that so on the one hand, contact tracing apps, the Aarogya Setu app that I briefly mentioned, has been made mandatory in certain pockets of the country where like not having the app is a criminal offense. So that automatically renders 86% of Indian women and 75% of all Indian adults liable to be prosecuted for the crime of not having an application on your phone, in a context where contact tracing apps already are built on questionable science. And at the same time, even relief measures are rendered inaccessible in a context where initially these were having access to these ID documentations was supposed to be voluntary, but a lot of, and this is sort of emblematic of the Indian government's digital governance measures over the last few years. It continues to operate in this voluntary mandatory void where things tend to be voluntary on paper, but in their enforcement they tend to be they've become mandatory. On that note, I would like to stop, and we would open ourselves up to some more discussion.
That's great. Aayush, thank you so much. I think Nagla wanted to respond to both Yolanda and you before we open up to questions. So Nagla.
Thank you, Malavika, and thank you, Aayush and Yolanda, for your wonderful presentations. I just had a couple of comments sort of building on keywords from what you've said. I think Yolanda is absolutely right in the sense of trying to be positive and try to find an opportunity out of all this, and that's a point that came in both your presentations. I think it's one of the positive things that took place in Egypt is just the way the government has done its best to deal with that first stage of the COVID-19 crisis, in the sense of sharing data every day. So the data, I don't reflects reality, but given the testing and what actually ends up in the, in the hands of the state, there is a daily release of data and information. So we look at this as hopefully a positive sign of sort of a building trust with the government. So that's one thing. The other point as well, that idea of really shedding light on the invisibility. I think this is key to this story on how the crisis has, whether we like it or not, it is just brought to the fore and a part of economies that have been either intentionally or unintentionally kept outside the radar and invisible. Now they are visible and they are there. Now the challenge is, will the dealings, and the hope is that there would be an inclusive and sort of a new, that's what I meant by new social contract. The worry is the continuation of the neoliberal that Aayush alluded to, the neoliberal policies that eventually continues to have swelling pockets of these groups. That's the challenge, and the hope is that the first option of sort of an inclusive social contract would take place so that we will have made use of this crisis as an opportunity to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nagla, and thank you, Yolanda and Aayush, for your really sharp comments. I think a lot of teams really rang through all of them, from the startling number of sort of people who don't have access to the basic utilities. From Egypt, you mentioned forms that people have to fill online, which is just almost satirical these days. So we are going to move into the Q&A section, and like I mentioned in the chat, if you have questions, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute and share the video access to you, or you can leave your question in the comments. While people do that, maybe I can kick it off the Q&A with a couple of questions directed to any of the speakers. I guess one of my questions, and given the theme of this series is when the music's over, this idea of what's going to happen, what are the second, third, fourth order effects that will happen over the next year or 2 years. When it comes to access and we talk about the digital divide, I wonder where you see the players come in of those who try to bridge this divide, and how that may affect the health of the sort of internet and digital ecosystem going forward, right? So we've seen in the last few years, companies like Facebook come in to promote free basics as this idea of bridging the digital divide, and we've seen that rejected on causes of net neutrality and concerns of really the sort of walling of the internet. I wonder where you might see players come in, whether in Egypt or India, across the world, really, to really bridge this divide, and how that may actually affect in the long term the sort of the digital ecosystem that we've built. And then maybe a second one, and if there's anything hopeful, anything exciting you've seen of innovative uses where we've seen people come together and maybe sort of dodge the digital divide, if you will, and where you've seen something positive that other countries can maybe look at to see of ways to whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, sort of ways to dodge the digital divide issue, which cannot be overcome in a short term anyway, and anything hopeful that you've seen either in your region or other places.
Maybe I can take it, and happy for other speakers to pitch from the local perspective. And I think it's really on this topic, I think it's really the local context, how that works in each country is really different and case by case. And to our first question, Dev, thanks for pointing it out, of how some of the private sector players are sometimes actually, they try to promote their service. They may or may not have some good intention, but it didn't work well, and which is the reality. And that is why I briefly mentioned about the project we're currently initiating with WEF. And the idea is really to look at the local ecosystem. So we start to realize when you talk about global firms and global ecosystem is not enough. Culture is different. Sometimes it's really not a technology fit. It's rather culture and policy, like really on the local ground. And so that's why, like for the WEF partnership, what we're looking at is how we can look into specific countries and look into their specific challenges in terms of digital divide could be one of the issues. But what is the really big issue, digital challenge for that particular country? And who are the local players and where the global players could fit in, and to really look at the local ecosystem rather than the global one. So that is one way to look at it. And in terms of the immediate fix, I think the example I mentioned in Mozambique of distributing devices like super quick, but it could be expensive as well and takes development aid and all of that. But another example in UNDP's portfolio is like in Philippines, we are building up the kind of free or low cost Wi-Fi for the country. And I think some places like the development agencies comes in where we could bring them little bit cheaper providers through the procurement and through some global network. But a lot of times it's really required the government to have the determination and the local players to really chime in for that. So I'll leave it there, and maybe Nagla and Aayush have something to add.
Yeah, I think maybe Nagla, you have a comment?
Sure, yes, thank And I'm going to pick up on a great point that Yolanda said about the culture of on the ground. I think a very important point is what I think of as the back end of the digital divide. So it could very well be the connectivity is very important, the access, but what happens when people use the technology? So you will have in society where a girl cannot have access to the computer because of some cultural limitations. So it's very important with the sort of with the other hand, with the other leg, if you will, to develop the cultural acceptance and use. And it's very important to develop even the educational level, because I mentioned the point about illiteracy. How can people expect their kids to, have access to digital technologies when they themselves cannot read or write? So there are a whole lot of other additional factors that are analog, but at the same time are very important to bridge the digital divide. A key issue, I think, is incentivizing. So people will use digital technologies. They will use smart cards. They will use ATMs if they're incentivized to use them for their own benefit and not just preached from the policies. And then in the end, I think the word appropriate technology is very important. I think also Yolanda mentioned simple appropriate technologies. So we don't have to go for the highest level of technology, but simple usable technologies that people can be incentivized to use, I think would be very important in that point. Thank you.
Yeah, Nagla, that's a great point. And I think speaks to also the question and comment that David Lee just sent in the chat, which is the role of agents and how sort of just people have come in and helped rural farmers to sell their products online, e-commerce, live streaming, who would presumably would not be able to, use these tools. But we've seen here in China, for instance, Taobao and Jingdong, as well as other platforms being used to raise large amounts of money and sell a lot of products, as people are, people still want to buy, the demand is still there, and, they just prefer to buy online. And and we've seen that in China, where as agents coming in and helping facilitate this transaction, as you said, incentives to sort of bring more incentives to the farmers here in this case to be able to do that. Yeah, if there's any similar examples, any other research in this area, as David has asked, it would be great if we can share, or as Aayush says, any hacks or on the ground workarounds that we've seen to sort of bridge this literacy problem, build the sort of digital literacy problem, and quickly try to help people out. And just to speak to these points as well, it's really great to see what Digital Asia Hub and the NOC can do. I see Urs has raised his hand. Urs, let me bring you in.
Thank you. I think I can unmute myself.
Perfect.
So I just wanted to say hi and thank you for these really eye-opening and excellent presentations. If I may, a suggestion, I know this was intended to be a small group, but if there is a way that you would feel comfortable to maybe turn this session into a video that could be shared more broadly, if necessary, edited, I'm sure we could help a little bit on the Berkman Klein. And because the stories you've told are so extraordinarily powerful, and I'm just deeply grateful for this opportunity. I do think, and this is some sort of following up on the last round of conversations here, and also David's excellent question. I really wonder, what a network like NOC, like Digital Asia Hub, what we can do to start to collect the stories that you brought to us today. What I also find particularly intriguing about the conversation is that it's not only problem description, and in some ways, of course, it's super important to better understand what are the challenges on the ground. For instance, to better understand as to what extent are these more general expressions of problems around the rule of law, or about a lack of infrastructure, or deeper layered economic injustices, as Nagla pointed out, that happened long before, as decisions before COVID hit, and which parts are some sort of novel and really related to a pandemic that's happening against the backdrop of these background conditions. So there's a lot of value in terms of nuanced problem description, but I'm also particularly intrigued about these hacks, these workarounds, and how they're shaped by culture, how they're some sort of in parts giving back agency to people who we don't think of having agency under normal conditions. And my question really is that maybe a place where researchers can come and be helpful by studying, by collecting, by some sort of building a shared repository of such experiences and cultural practices. And then maybe over time also learn from them and see what could be elevated, what can we learn from it post-crisis as we enter recovery at some point, hopefully, and what are implications for policy frameworks and organizational models and the way we structure the digital sphere and how it connects to the analog sphere as you just described it. So it's not a question, but just really a big thank you and maybe a few reflections what it does when I listen to you in my brain and just in awe of all the work you do. So thank you so much for hosting us, and thanks for your contributions.
Thank you, Urs. Nagla, did you want to quickly respond to Melina's question in the chat? And maybe that could be what we close with.
Oh, definitely. I think this is just like I mentioned that COVID-19 is shaking a lot of what's happening. And Melina's point is very interesting because now it's making us reconsider. So my talk was about looking into our weaknesses, socioeconomic weaknesses, but perhaps it makes us reconsider what our priorities are. Just to give you again an example from Egypt, a few months ago when the Minister of Education was talking about giving students you know, an iPad or some kind of a gadget, he was ridiculed. But maybe not so much anymore, because it looks like this is going to last for a good few months. I am privileged to be working in a private university where we have the facilities and we go online. And one of the suggestions actually that I am giving the committee of my university that I'm on about the future of academics for my university is how can we take our experience of sort of, you know, being thrown into the online teaching as professors, and we've managed quite well to take it to the larger sphere in Egypt. And in that sense, this could be, we have a role as, you know, a social responsibility role as an education institution to share our experience. And this would be one way to provide new technologies and it will not be as alien as before. Now, this requires a lot of support, a lot of financial raising funds, you know, to provide the technology, etc. But to Melina's point, I think this is causing, whether we like it or not, it's like a seismic change in how we think, and hopefully this can put on the forefront of the government health and education as a priority, but also in our cultural and daily lives, it will make a difference, that's for sure. And then it remains to be seen, of course. The future is just, you know, unfolding day by day. So yes, great point, Melina, thank you. Thank you, Malvika, as well.
Thank you, Nagla. I wish we had time to, if we had, I would have cold called Amy Johnson, who's on the call, because I would love to hear, we always think of technologies as necessarily being digital, but there's a whole history of technologies being all kinds of artifacts that are not necessarily electronic or digital. So I think the kinds of technologies that are emerging in times of crises by people, the low-tech ways, the hacks, the workarounds that Urs described, there's a whole history of that, and I would have loved to hear from Amy about this. But I just want to quickly give you a heads up that our session next week will actually focus more deeply on access and infrastructure. We'll have Sonia Jorge from the Web Foundation, from the Alliance for Affordable Internet, and we'll have Julian Thomas from RMIT in Melbourne, who actually helped to co-author the Australian Inclusion Index. So we will sort of carry on this conversation about access, infrastructure, and inclusion along that axis next week. So we hope you can all join us. And I'm conscious of time now, so I would love to hear from all your stories. So if people have other questions and comments, do send them to us at the hub, and we'll make sure that Nagla, Yolanda, and Aayush can see them. And we'll find a way for them to respond in the note that we share, maybe even the video that Urs offered that Berkman could help with. So thank you all for being a part of this. we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much to our speakers, and virtual claps for everyone. Thank you. Have a safe evening. Bye. Stay
Thanks,
healthy,
everyone.
everyone.